Right. Well, look, let's gather around and talk about the message of Christmas, I guess. We're going to start by looking in Luke, and to save a little bit of time, I've put it up on the screen so you can follow along with me as we read through. So this comes from Luke 2 and 8 to 20. There were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them. Do not be afraid. I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people. Today, in the town of David, a Saviour has been born to you. He is Christ the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger. Suddenly, a great company of the heavenly hosts appeared, and the angel praising God, with the angel and praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace to all on whom his favour rests." When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, missing an S, "Let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about." So they hurried off and found Mary and Joseph and the baby who was lying in the manger. When they clearly needed to check my spelling. When they had seen them, they spread the word concerning what had been told them about this child, and all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds said to them. But Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all the things they had heard and seen, which were just as they had been told. Okay. Verses you've heard very, very often before in the past. Tonight, we're looking at one small thing that changes everything. I'm guessing there's quite a few of you who've been following along the chat thread on our cooking and serving chat thread who will know that my brother had one of these moments just the last week or so. He was literally on holiday in Tasmania in Hobart and was one day away from getting on the plane, coming back to New Zealand and having had a lovely fine holiday. One little thing got in the way, a little rat test. One little line and one little rat test changed everything. All of a sudden, he had to find a hotel, he had to try and deal with his car, and he had to self-isolate for an entire week. One little line and one little rat test, and everything changed. It happens sometimes in life, doesn't it? One little thing can change everything. I guess the most significant time that happened for me was some years ago now, and I went on a weekend down to Christchurch. Now, I was down in Christchurch because there was a singles conference on. The singles conference was being run by Grace Church. And so I went on down there and I went to the first workshop, and that was all fine. But sitting in the row in front of me, I thought was not too bad, really. Looked quite good to me. I even got to talk to him at the morning tea break. And we had a nice conversation, but I have to tell you, if you want a chat up line, this is the chat up line. I like your boots. Worked wonders. Anyway, as it happened, you had to choose your workshops. And he wasn't in any of the workshops I had for the rest of the day. So our paths didn't cross at all. So that could have been that, really. When we got to the final session, I was in the middle of a row in a church, so long rows of pews, and I was in the middle of a row. And I was talking to a lady who happened to have been a speaker at one of the workshops. And she was very interesting because she had been one of the speakers. So I was talking to her and having a nice conversation, when out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that man standing down the end of the pew, just waiting for me. And me being me and, not wanting too easy to get, I made him wait. So I carried on my conversation with the speaker, and we talked, and little did I know that underneath it all, he was going, "If that dizzy dame doesn't hurry up and stop her conversation, I'm out of here." Luckily, he waited. And shortly thereafter, I went down and I spoke to him. Now, the truth of the matter is that little tiny act of patience on his part changed everything. Because the truth of the matter is that man I'm talking to you about is now sitting at the end of that table over there. And as of last Tuesday, we've been married for 8 years. So one little thing, his patience paid off, and he stayed there and he waited for me, and it changed absolutely everything.
And your boots.
And my boots, Yeah, the boots changed everything. You know, things do change, and sometimes not even for the good. I can remember vividly a day when I was sitting in a staff meeting, they let me take my phone in because they knew I was waiting a phone call. And that phone call was going to tell me whether my son had this terrible disease or not. And so I got that phone call, and it did. It changed everything from that day on for my son and also for me. It changed our entire life. One little phone call changes everything. But it doesn't just happen on the personal scale. It can also happen on a global scale. I bet every single one of you in the room can remember where you were when you heard the Queen died. I was at Melbourne Airport in the bathroom. Well, a person beside me said, "Oh, sad news about the Queen." I went, "What about the Queen?" And she said, "Oh, she's gone." And then the funny thing was, it hit me like a rock because I've only ever lived with a Queen. And then suddenly we was not a queen anymore. We had a king, and it was as if the whole world changed in that moment. Throughout history, things have changed, often on a very small thing. I remember when the internet came in, I was in a meeting and I was talking about the internet, and an older guy to me said, "You don't need to worry about that. It'll be gone in just a few years." One small thing that changed everything. I'm sure if it had been back in the day, the printing press, someone would have said, "Oh, you don't want that thing." Changes everything. In fact, you can trace back through history time and time and time again where one small thing has changed everything. In fact, you can go right back to Julius Caesar when he crossed the Rubicon. That's a phrase we use in English language, isn't it? Crossing the Rubicon, meaning you take one small thing and it changes everything. Well, it wasn't that long before Julius Caesar got that idea into his head that God had another idea. And his idea was to send his son. And when he did that, it changed absolutely everything thereafter in the world. Now, it's always difficult when you're trying to do the Christmas service. What are you supposed to say? What can you possibly say that hasn't already been said? So I thought about it, and I thought, kings are quite good. Like the kings, they're good. Pretty stellar, really. They get a star. I mean, how good is that? Yeah, kings are pretty good. But Mary, Joseph, Zechariah, they all get a personal one-on-one, face-to-face with an angel. Be that. I mean, that's pretty darn good. Absolutely. But the shepherds. The shepherds not only get a one-on-one, face-to-face personal visitation from an angel, but then they get an entire brass band, symphony orchestra, angels everywhere cascading down from heaven. Yep, these shepherds got the lot. So I thought I'd like to talk about the shepherds. Now, the shepherds are an interesting lot because they weren't exactly the most popular people around. It is very surprising that God chose to use the shepherds. Even the locals didn't like them. They were generally considered, unreliable, untrustworthy, probably drunks, generally the criminal, the lowest element of society. But God decided, well, let's just show them. And now I want to show you a little play. You see, when I was very, very young, I got to be in the Christmas play. And I was very proud of myself. I was the junior shepherd. And you might not think that's much, but that was a promotion. Because for me, up to that point, I'd been the sheep. But this year, I got to be the junior shepherd. And so I had this part in the play where I had to get up and I had to say, "Look, an angel, Bill, it's an angel. Listen, Bill, listen. Don't be afraid. Oh, it's okay, Bill. It's good news, Bill. Guess what? It's a baby, Bill. It's going to be great. A baby's being born in Bethlehem. Oh, and that baby is going to be the saviour of the world. Oh, my goodness. From the milk. Angels shouting, singing. Listen. The highest for men on whom his favour rests. Now, at that point in the play, Bill stands up and he says something along the lines of this. Angels? Angels? Chums. If I go home and tell my Elsie that I've seen angels, she'll say, have you been drinking? Drunk? And then she'll say, God in a stable? Flippin' fable. And get your feet off the table. Well, that's how the play went anyway. But the thing is that what is so amazing about that story is that it is so utterly unbelievable. God turning up with an entire angelic chorus. It's incredible. It's awesome. It's unbelievable. And in fact, it's so unbelievable you wouldn't think it happened until it does. And then it's a fact. It's not just an idea. Actually, just last night, I happened to watch some of Joanna Lumley on TV, and she was up in the Norway in the Northern Lights, and she was seeing the aurora, you know, how the wonderful Northern Lights that you can see, and she stood there absolutely struck with awe at these incredible lights. And as I watched it, I thought, oh, you ain't seen nothing yet, girl. Imagine that was angels stretched across the sky from one side to the other. Well, they had pretty big news that they wanted to tell. And it was like God opened up the night sky and said, this is important. I am sending a tiny, small little baby into that world, but it's going to change everything. And it was kind of like saying to the shepherds, look, I can't contain these angels any longer. Take a peek. Have a look. This is what's going on in heaven right now. Because this is the moment when God is coming to earth. You know, it's a funny thing about that moment, because although thousands of people across the world may not want to recognize it, yet we order all of our time, certainly in the Western world, as in the moment BC, before Christ, and the moment Anno Domini, which means in the year of our Lord. We've kind of come to the realization that that one moment, when the shepherds saw the angels, when God sent his son, that is the pivot moment of history. Everything that comes before and everything that's come after. And that's why it's so important, because God was doing something all new, and it was big, even though it started as a tiny little baby. Here was God on earth with arms and legs and hair. I'm guessing he had hair, might not have had hair, don't know about that, but he had toes and he had all of the other bits and probably even a little button nose. God had arrived. So tonight I thought we'd look very quickly at three things that were true before the angels sang, and three things that were true after the angels have sung. So let's have a look at the first one. It's up there for you. Before the angels sang, before the shepherds saw that wondrous sight, before God sent Jesus down into the world, we simply couldn't know God like we do now. For years, ancient peoples understood that there was some notion of God. They wanted this idea of God. They thought, we think there has to be some sort of God, but we don't really know what he's like, and we certainly don't know if he's reliable. We're really not sure. He might be nice, but he might not be. He might be really vindictive too, and he might be really horrible. So I tell you what, we better do all sorts of stuff to try to keep him on the right side with us, because we want our crops, we want all the things to go right for us, so we're going to appease the gods to try to keep God, whatever God is, right with us. And it's certainly true that there are some notable characters in the Bible who knew God pretty well. You're thinking your Abrahams, your Moses, your Davids, your King Josiah, lots of people who knew God well, but they couldn't know God like we can. So first of all, we couldn't know God. Secondly, we couldn't reach God. It's an interesting thing that the Jewish people particularly made an absolute art form of trying to make sure you did absolutely everything right so that you could be good enough to reach God. And so they put together a huge law book to make sure that you didn't do anything that in any way might get you offside with the big guy. What they also worked out, sadly, is that none of us could live up to it. Not one of us. None of us were good enough to be able to just get to God. So we couldn't reach God either. And then finally, we couldn't escape our mortal condition. The truth of the matter is, we are mortal, and mortal means we die. And so long as we were before the angels sang, we had no way of breaking through that death barrier. Even the Pharisees had a place they called Sheol. But Sheol wasn't heaven. It was like a waiting room in the hope that maybe they'd been good enough to get through. And the Sadducees didn't really believe in a heaven at all. So before the angels sang, you couldn't escape the mortal reality of death. It was before every one of us. You had your years and then you were done. All right, so that's how it was before the angels sang. Let's see what difference it made. How did it change everything when Jesus came? Well, now, the bottom line is we can know, really know what God is like. Jesus himself said when he was on the earth that if you have seen me, you have seen God. If you get to know what I'm like, get to know how I think, what my values are, what my traits are, you can be absolutely certain that's what God is like. Because God and me, we are one. In fact, he was God on earth, God in human form. So if you know Jesus, you know God. You can actually know the God who made you. Secondly, when Jesus came to earth, he didn't come without a plan. He knew what his job was. He knew that we had a problem. Ever since the world has begun, people have been cruel, hurtful, nasty, evil, wicked, greedy, holding grudges, showing envy, all of the things that make us less than what we'd like to be. And he knew that no matter how much we tried to be good, we could never get rid of all the things that we have already done. So the sin problem had to be solved. And Jesus came to lead a life that would mean that when he went to the cross, he could absorb all of the evil, all of the hatred into himself, and to give us the chance to have a free start with forgiveness of sin. He allowed that to come onto him that we might be forgiven. And that's pretty cool, I have to say. And then finally, people often look to the cross, but we should never forget the resurrection. Because when Jesus came, he not only died to forgive our sins, but he also came back to life again. Now, I don't know about you, but a person who walks on the face of this planet and says that you do have a future with God, you just need to believe and God will take you into eternity, is pretty good, you have to admit. There's been quite a lot of peaceful kind of people who've said, I want to bring peace on earth. But he's saying, I want to actually bring peace with you and God. That is amazing. Now, if he just said it, it would be impressive. To say it, to die, to be buried, and then to come back to life and actually prove it, that's awesome. That is out of this world. Jesus beat death. He gave us the chance to live with God forever in heaven. And so now we are no longer caught by the mortal end of our lives, but we get to go on and be with him if we choose to take up his invitation. And I guess for tonight, it's really important for me to not just stand here and say some fine words, but to actually say that I met Jesus 50 years ago. I'm not that old, I'm only 56, so you can tell I was young. But in all of that time, he hasn't let me down. I'm not saying that life has always been easy, it hasn't. But the truth of the matter is, God has been beside me and has worked through the good times and the bads and has not let me down at any point. I know that the times when I'm not quite perfect are getting covered by his grace, because I'm not always perfect. And sometimes I do stuff that I really hate myself for doing. But Jesus said, I've covered it. It's okay. And I also can stand here tonight going, I know that for me, I place my faith in Jesus. That means I know that when I die, and I will not stay there, but rather I will be welcomed into God's heaven. And he'll probably say, what's taking you so long to get here, girl? Because he wants to be with me forever. He wants to be with you forever. That's the enormous change that came into the world when the angels sang on that night. No wonder they were excited. It was the best news ever. Tonight at your tables, I have two questions up there. You see, if you already know Jesus, then I'd like you to answer question A. The question is, how does having Jesus in your life change everything for you? Because as people who've met Jesus, we should be able to answer that question. How has it changed everything so that our lives are real and alive and worth living and so much more? You know what I mean? And if you're out there thinking, oh, I don't really know where I stand on this Jesus stuff. It sounds good when you say it, but I'm sort of on the fence. I really don't quite know where I fit with Jesus right now. Then I'd like you to think about this question. How would you like Jesus to change things in your life, or even in the world for that matter? If you could just for a minute go, okay, let's just say he is true, and that all of what I've said is true, then how would you like Jesus to change things?